Good afternoon. Thank you
Feel
for your
free to
time.
pull that down to where you're comfortable.
Thank you for your time and attention. I just wanted to make sure that I was going to be discussing the right subject. So to my understanding, the amendment in whole was recreational marijuana, which included cannabis, which would entail everything, including CBD. Am I on the right page?
Is that correct, Mr. Moran? Yeah.
I think you probably
Yes.
want to hear from Mr. Polk or Donna or someone on that.
Pardon?
You probably want to hear from Mr. Polk or one of the other individuals that are working on this.
Yeah, do you want them to outline that?
Yes,
first?
ma'am. I just want to make sure that I'm on the right page with everybody.
Okay. Do we have a staffer who can jump up and quickly address that, and we'll hold your time? So
Okay.
that we're going to
Oh,
get
okay.
you your answer. Just hang in there, and you'll get your time back, and
Oh, perfect. Let me just grab my...
it'll just take a second. Go ahead.
Afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, Tom Polk, Planning Development Services. The question was asked of Mr. DeMarsh earlier with regard to CBD. And when we review the ordinance as it is, specifically with the definition, we currently have an inconsistency with the Federal Act 2014, the Farm Act, with our definition. We recognize that, and although we're not enforcing with CBD, we are with the medical marijuana. We are recognizing, with the board's direction, potentially of making a change to the ordinance to create a consistency. When we put our ordinance together, and when the 2014 Act came together, it was all within a couple of months of each other, and so at that point, even the CBD industrial hemp conversation was at an infancy. And again, we were in infancy with our ordinance as well. And we certainly recognize the need to be amending the ordinance as we progress. And this is an instance where we need to keep up with the current legislation federally, at least at this point, going forward.
Okay, so you would agree with, I think it was Ms. Powell, that we are in conflict with the Federal Act?
With that Federal Act specifically, yes. With regard to CBD, potentially specifically hemp, and again, we're talking about hemp, industrial hemp, at 0.3% THC levels or less. And admittedly, we're seeing CBD oil, even hemp seeds being sold in our local markets. And unbeknownst to us, until it was brought to our attention today, we do see a conflict with the definition that we currently have. And because we include in our definition the cannabis family, and hemp is a cousin of marijuana, and it's all part of the genus cannabis.
And if I could just say...
So would you recommend that we postpone any decision on this until you get your definition in line with federal government? And
Chair, you all can do whatever you want, but the issue that Mr. Polk is raising is something we would have to address back to you all anyway. It's not really probably the topic of the agenda item today, but you all can handle that however you want.
Okay. All right. So you do agree we have a problem?
We recognize we have an inadvertent conflict right now based upon the federal legislation that was passed in 2014.
Does anybody have any questions?
I got a question.
Mr. Mayo?
Just so I'm clear, I think many of us read the Joe Redner case, which was referenced. We've got a glitch in what we've produced as an ordinance. So when people came up and were talking about the medical use of the CBD oil, and I'm sitting here saying, what are they talking about? We're not prohibiting medical use. They were right in that this new rule, if passed, would fly in the face of current federal regulations.
Again, the ordinance that we have, and I think we need to separate the conversation out because
Please.
You're looking at a recreational conversation as the main topic here.
Correct.
As part of the dialogue today, the CBD issue has been brought to our attention, and we recognize that there is a conflict with that based upon what the federal and state laws are right now with our definition.
Okay.
One suggestion is that we would work on the definition of hemp and CBD oils and such that would go along with that if the board's wanting to go there to differentiate. I don't think we're that far off base, but I can see the concern of CBD users and particularly other ones, stores that are selling. And I mean, we can go into local markets and find hemp seed. Yeah. Technically, that is going against our ordinance at this point. So we need to make that correction, in my opinion, go forward. But then that doesn't have anything to do with the other conversation, I believe, with respect to the topic today.
Okay, I think that clears it up, at least makes it more clear for me. Laughing aside, we're trying to get through this for you all. The tintillating little giggling and laughing certainly isn't helpful to what you're trying to promote here. Then that's why we're going to ask these questions.
And Commissioners, I might add, if the knowledgeable audience would know, particularly in areas that do have legal marijuana, their ordinances are constantly changing, trying to keep up with this industry. The industry is changing on a very challenging pace for everybody on both sides, both the regulators, the users, the business people. So I think they understand, they should understand, if they're knowledgeable, that we're all in this game together, but there are going to be gaps and periods as we go forward. And we're trying our best to keep up with that, but also listen to the commission as to where they wish to see the county go forward. And so this is something we've identified that was brought to our attention, and we'd certainly review it and come back with you with what we found.
Well, wouldn't you say that since the federal government lags behind all of the states in almost everything, including being able to deposit drug money in a bank, that probably all the other states that approved this, they're in conflict with the federal act too, aren't they?
Well, the federal act with regard to agriculture is where the CBD conversation comes into place.
Okay.
The
agriculture.
Yeah, it was the 2014 act, and then there was a local state law that came forward that was mentioned earlier. I mean, we could talk for a long time about the industry itself and the problems, or maybe not, that are occurring, but this is an ever-challenging, growing conversation nationwide. I know personally the city of Denver has changed their regulating ordinances close to 30 times over the last 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. It's just to that level of trying to keep ahead of things.
Okay, hang on, Commissioner Carrizzulo.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tom. And I would say that this is not a small issue per se about what to do with this CBD, because as Tom indicated, you're not referring to places that are dispensaries per se with these products. I mean, it's a conventional retail product.
And federally legal.
And yeah, so there isn't this threat, although I don't know how if it's even very likely that whatever the act was in the 70s or something that makes hemp and cannabis and all this stuff illegal is ever going to be enforced. But to your point about something in its infancy, is that these aren't irrelevant details. This is a whole different public policy thing, what's going on here, and it's going on in multiple different tangents in different ways, and it just to me it seems it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a preemptive action if there are all these ambiguities to it, and that's really the point. The CBD thing didn't occur to me until today, until I was just recalling driving by, and I'm saying, how many of these places have these signs out front? Now, granted, the ones that I pass are typically in the city of Sarasota, so this wouldn't count, but that's a common element. And to the response, well, we're not going to enforce that. Then you got to get to a point of saying, well, if we're going to have an ordinance that we're not going to enforce, what are we endeavoring to do in the first place? So this is very complicated.
Well, again, with respect to the CBD, we have not been enforcing that component. We do need, recognizing that we do need to clean that portion up going forward.
But you didn't have an ordinance in place before today, potentially. There is not an ordinance that deals with cannabis products. right?
Well, we have an ordinance with regard to medical marijuana.
But that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
Right, but as part of our medical marijuana ordinance, we have a definition that includes CBD in its purest interpretation.
Right, so pass the ordinance, then tomorrow you do have a policy that prohibits the sale of that item.
Well, again, at this point, we've allowed it. One could suggest it's a non-conforming use of some sort, but we inadvertently have discovered as of today the inconsistency that we have with that. And as going forward, we would need to be looking at that, coming back to the board to try to correct that.
I think you're right
While
on.
we still, while we still have you, Ms. Quinn, is this answering your question that you first generated this discussion with?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good.
I just wanted to make sure that I was speaking on the right matter.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mayo.
Tom, I think this is going to help a lot of us, but I'm asking it so it helps me. So the young lady that came up before, who is a lifelong resident of Sarasota and has a store that sells this, technically could get caught up in the previous legislation we passed on medical marijuana use. But there's a law that's a glitch for us, so we'll go back and clean up that legislation so she's not any longer in violation, because we'd have locally a situation like Tampa just had. Is that making any sense?
Well, we've been throwing a lot of different things together. You're talking about the Redner decision. We're talking about CBD and what we've discovered with respect to the CBD. And again, we inadvertently, and never was to our attention until now, that we had an inconsistency with CBD sales that were consistent from 2014 on. Again, in discussions that we've had staff-wise, we think it would be appropriate to clear that up by creating more additional language in the medical marijuana ordinance that distinguishes hemp and CBD product to differentiate the two. Again, that is a separate conversation from what you're considering today. And also with respect to the Redner decision, it's just come out, and it's largely tied to licensing, as was mentioned. And again, you know, the state will probably appeal that, and it's still in a fluctuation with respect to some of these decisions going forward. You mentioned flower buds and smoking earlier. There's been judicial decisions made on that are being appealed immediately by the state. This is in a flux, obviously, and so we are going to really need to be consistent with the approach of trying to keep aware of some consistencies and inconsistencies as we go forward. I would say, though, that our ordinance has been reviewed with our legislation and is consistent with the approach that this board adopted in 2014 of allowing the medical marijuana dispensaries to be looked at on a case-by-case basis with a special exception. That was the intent of the board in 2014 and was followed by this board in the considerations for the two dispensaries we currently have.
And I would just add, Tom, that don't ever infer from what I'm asking. Nobody on our staff needs to be the least bit defensive. The example is the hearing that happens after this is 2 6-inch binders clearing up all the inconsistencies in our land development code and our site and development code and our zoning code. So it's a complex world. That's going to happen. I was simply asking not to make any of our staff feel that they need to be defensive. I just want to hear exactly what's happening, prompted by this young lady, Ms. Quinn's question. That's all.
And again,
you have been present through the whole meeting. You work for us, and I hope you're taking note of anything else that we need to fix. Maybe people have brought up problems and they certainly provenly brought up problems that we need to fix. So if you'll continue to take notes. We are going to hear from Mr. DeMarche, our attorney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, as to this issue, I think for the commission, I would say that the purpose of today's ordinance was to deal with non-medical marijuana as we would refer to it as recreational use. It was not at all the purpose of this ordinance to deal with the hemp-derived products. But there will be a need to analyze the federal law, the state law with respect to that issue and come back with proposals for an amendment, whether or not the ordinance before you passes. So this was not an attempt to put in a ban on something. It's just, as Mr. Polk has said, something that's been brought to the attention in a fast-moving environment. I just want to make clear that the drafting of what's before you today was not at all intended to hit that issue. But if you take no action today on this ordinance, they need to come back to you with a proposal with respect to amending the existing provisions.
And that's fine, but I am not comforted to hear that after careful review, we are in compliance with our own rule of 2014. We're looking at
and you
projecting
always
towards the
have
future, not
you have the option
double-stamping the
to
past.
continue this matter and try to deal with it then. That's not the purpose of my wanting to speak to you about this now. I just wanted to indicate that irrespective of what you do, I think there'll be a proposal brought to you for your consideration to bring the code up to date.
Okay. Thank you, unless you have, Commissioner Moran?
Well,
You have
I guess,
some
why do we
questions?
have this then?
Hmm?
Yeah, I mean, going with what you just said, Mr. DeMarsh and Tom, please, this has nothing to do with the hard work that you've done, because I've been very, proud of all the hours that you put in to try to help advise us what to do. So we currently have an ordinance in place that we've recognized a problem. I'm very uncomfortable even continuing to consider voting on an ordinance that, with this new information coming like it is, to do that. This type of conversation, really, thinking about it now, should have probably done in a workshop type setting to get information from the public, is what I asked for last time, and I'm glad so many people have come. Now our staff, we have experts, legal experts. We're not ready to do this yet, and there is no imminent threat right in front of us. If there was, we have time. So to continue on and blend this medical marijuana with recreational marijuana for another hour, hour and a half, I don't know where we're going to go, because no way am I ready to vote on anything like this in regards to an ordinance.
Okay, Mr. Moran?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wow, this is a perfect segue. I think this board, I know I have probably at least 10 times on this dais, have tried to make it crystal clear that what's before us today is recreational marijuana. We've made it clear on this board in the past, and we've acknowledged it and differentiated between the value of medical benefits related to cannabis. While this meeting here we're having today, I think, is a perfect example what states around the country are struggling with and the nation as a whole is struggling with. It's kind of a small example of it. What's important to me when everybody's trying to play legal word chess is when you get into these situations where people are disagreeing on an issue, is what is the intent of it, at least before what's this board, or at least me personally, what the intent of this is very important to me, is while these politicians and the attorneys and the lobbyists in Tallahassee and the court systems and are fumbling around in Tallahassee and fumbling around nationally on this issue, I personally am going to do everything in my power to send a clear message that recreational marijuana is not welcome in Sarasota County. That was the purpose of putting this ordinance forward, as far as at least my concern, which could take years, decades to clear up some of these questions that were eloquently put. Again, the intent of it, the underlying current, the intent of it is a clear message to whoever's listening in Tallahassee or other places that, again, recreational marijuana is not welcome here. I empathize with the attorneys to have to do the legwork on this related to the CBD oil. I'm very familiar with it. It personally wasn't my intent whatsoever. I don't classify that or categorize that whatsoever as far as a recreational use. Now, whether legally that is troublesome or what's before us today, I get it. But again, intent is very important to me, and CBD oil was not the intent, at least coming from this commissioner. So hopefully that helps.
I would agree with your intent, but I also agree with Commissioner Hines. At this point, I think we've got a flawed piece to work on here, to vote on, and I would rather that we wait and get it all put together and bring it back when it's in a better form, at least. Commissioner Hines?
Madam Chair, I'm happy to make a motion on, and I don't know the proper form on whether it would be to table this or to withdraw this proposed ordinance in order to give our staff time to bring back an ordinance that we could consider that would potentially meet federal laws and changing, current laws. And maybe even to restructure the way that we're looking at this more in a workshop program type situation rather than through a proposed advertised ordinance. So that's probably two motions. But
we can table it and then you vote to take it up again. But I don't know if we change the form, if that's correct.
It'd probably have to be re-advertised, and the ordinance new language would have to be posted.
Mr. Moran, you're still on the board. Were you up next, or are we going to Mr. Mayo?
Commissioner Mayo can go ahead.
Okay, Commissioner Mayo.
All right. I think our staff and our attorney have distinguished clearly enough for me what we're voting on today or talking about voting on today, as opposed to the CBD oil.
Do you have to go to the bathroom or something? Because this is not how we do this.
Before you table this and vote on it, I would like to speak. That's all I'm asking.
No.
Because once you table it, I cannot speak. Okay, that's why
You're going to have to wait.
I didn't mean interrupted, but what I have to say is very important.
Okay.
Continue, Mr. Mayo.
I'm very careful because I don't want to see any more defensiveness on the part of any of our employees. I got it. We'll fix the old ordinance so we're in compliance, if that's the will of the board, so that we're in compliance with this federal regulation. That said, is there a harm in continuing a discussion solely about recreational marijuana? Now, quite frankly, I think things got very confused because people in the audience were here saying, whoa, you are talking about this, whether you realize it or not, but we've separated out that piece for now. So whether this group agrees or not agrees, whether this board, it seems like it's going to be split, I'm not sure there's a harm with continuing the discussion, since everyone's here, on banning the recreational marijuana use.
Well, since that's kind of not what's outlined here, and since Mr. DeMar said we are going to have to come back on this topic again anyway, he could come back with what Mr. Moran's trying to accomplish and also with all the changes that have been red flagged and that are necessary to our existing policy. So either way, we'd have to come back on this issue. Mr. Moran?
Yeah, I just wanted to take 1 minute. I feel the need to address this due to some of the antics here this morning. I think our nation is just absolutely starving for political and policy discussions where people that disagree on an issue can have calm, intellectually honest discussions and try to find some common ground. And I was just a little disappointed this morning that didn't take place. With that said, I thought this afternoon was incredibly encouraging, and I was optimistic. I thought there was just good testimony. That's what we do here, is we listen to testimony, we listen to input, we listen to evidence, and make decisions. That was not the case this morning, if you ask me. But there's some confusion this morning. I think that people are not being heard. I've heard before that the most tortured state a person can be in is to not be recognized or not be heard. And I can assure you that that's not the case, at least from this commissioner, and I've worked with many of these fine folks for many years, that we're listening. We just might be calmly and just politely disagreeing. So I think there's a difference to that, at least in my mind. So if these conversations continue, I hope we can keep an intellectually honest, healthy dialogue of talking back and forth, and at the end of that, coming to hopefully some common ground. So thank you for the extra time.
Well, basically, Commissioner Hines has a motion.
Again, I've heard some interest, and I have no problem with it, to continue. The people are here. Let them, now with all this clarification that's occurred, give us their views. But no way by means is what we've advertised ready to be voted on, potentially approved. I just think there's just way too many tweaks to that ordinance and things that we need to consider before we vote on it. So I don't know if anybody agrees with that.
And having said that, we would once again have to take the identical public input, multiple hours of it, on the next proposal.
If there's support to even bring one back. I mean,
well, we have things that need to be fixed.
well, that's a given. I'm talking about the recreational one.
Right.
So we there may not be support to bring that ordinance back after what we've heard. So I don't know how many other cards you got, because we got a whole LDR thing that we got to consider.
We have this many.
Yes, I mean, we go for the rest of the day.
Madam Chair, if I may. I think.
First of all, I would like to address the question to Mr. DeMarche about would we table or would we just vote down 7?
I think you'll end up in the same place if you were to table it. You either continue the matter, unless you pass it, it dies. It's over. You have to continue it, pass it, or it'll die, and it will not be. You'd have to re-advertise an ordinance, have new public hearings in order to adopt something. So, I think the concept of tabling is really, if you want to keep it alive, you continue it.
Commissioner Moran.
The only thing I'd add to that is we've had a couple of these over the last 2 days. We've had a lot of issues that we've dealt with here, that ultimately decisions need to be made. We get paid to make decisions up here. Some people might not like them. There might be disagreements. Again, if we're keeping with the foundational conversation of what the intent of this, the intent is crystal clear to me what this ordinance is before us today. And the political courage or stupidity, call it whatever you want, is I believe this needs a vote up or down.
Madam Chair.
Well, if we intend to vote up or down, then we would have to continue the public hearing first and then have a vote.
It's one of your options. You could adopt the ordinance before you and instruct staff to come back with a discussion on amending for this particular issue that needs to be addressed. So you could do it that way as well.
Commissioner Mayo.
Okay. Let me see if I can craft something here that gets 3 votes. I think Commissioner Hines struggled valiantly, and I think in my mind succeeded in a compromise place for today. Let the meeting continue today. Let the people that are here speak, and then decide about continuing it to another day. I'm not voting to put it down today, but that seems the right way to handle this. We ask for dialogue. We want people to come in. A lot of rudeness, a lot of nastiness, a lot of name calling, not a lot of swearing in our hearing room. Wonderful. How very nice. But now reasonable people seem to be here wanting to address their elected officials. I'm not prepared to vote to end this today.
Okay.
But in addition, and I'm sorry, always must appear to be long-winded, and that's just my way, I suppose, and I'll have to live with it, and unfortunately, others will too. We have a lot of staff assembling. I've been at this a long time for the UDC. If you have that many cards, and if we are, two big ifs, I'm only one vote, we're going to let everybody speak, we need to postpone the 3.5 to 4.5 hour UDC conversation that follows this.
Okay. Commissioner Carrizzulo, did you have anything?
I had a curiosity about enforcement on the ordinance. Can you just tell me again, Mr. DeMarche, you're saying the enforceability of what's in this ordinance is in question?
I'm not ready to conclude one way or another on that. With respect to I'm not in a position.
Well, and I asked the question because it's like, okay, so, all right. I'm going to dumb this down to my level. We're talking about something speculative and preemptive, and now there are questions about what's enforceable. It's a double whammy, if you ask me. I mean, I think there are some things that need to be cleared up here, and it's all because this is not quite as easy of an issue as we would make it out to be, both from its practical policy implications, but from the speculative component that keeps coming into that. And I'm just wondering, is like, I don't know do we have elaborate conversations about ordinances that we don't enforce, regardless of how we might feel about them? I think that's kind of in a weird place.
Is that a question?
It's just yeah.
All right. Well, to get back on track here, what I'm hearing is that we go ahead and proceed with this issue, proceed with public input, which is this many cards times 5, and then we postpone the UDC.
Madam Chair, there's not that many people in the room of those cards.
Well,
so I mean, I don't
maybe
know how
some
many
of them
people
left.
have left to testify. Is it 5 or is it 10?
This many people have testified.
1, 2, 3,
This
4,
many
5,
people
6,
are
7,
left.
8, 9, 10. There's like 12.
All right,
12,
we're going to
13.
zip through
All right.
them, so that's what we're going to do.
Please don't take all the 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, what about relieving our staff from a 4-hour presentation on the UDC? Just postpone it.
Well, I'm fine with that too, if everyone else is fine
Procedurally,
with
you
that.
would wait until this item's concluded, and then you would open and continue the UDC. They don't have to sit here for a continuance, but you wouldn't continue it right now. You would do so when you get to that item.
So that's the signal. That's the signal for Mr. Lewis to release them, even though we haven't continued it, but we're proffering that we will continue it.
Right. Okay, we are going to continue with public input, and I call upon Walter Steele, followed by Epiphany Roa.
Yeah, she never really got started.
Pardon?
She never finished.
Oh, Stacy, you're the one that started all this trouble. Get back up here.
Sorry, I have a tendency of doing things like that.
Well, you should feel very empowered when people say you're not listened to. You were given 5 minutes, and in a half a minute, you stopped the proceedings for an hour. So good job, Stacy. Don't do that again with your remaining 4.5 minutes. But
Yes, ma'am.
but you were listened to. You red flagged a problem, which resulted in a change of course by us, and that's how public input works with government to result in a result that you want to see, versus screaming obscenities, which we saw this morning was very non-productive and gets you escorted from the room. So you're doing it right, and you're welcome to continue. We have 4.5 minutes for you.
Okay.